Ark Raiders has been quietly building one of the most layered and unsettling lore universes in modern gaming, and tonight we are going to sit with every fragment of that broken story and piece it all together, nice and slow. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So quick note from me before we get into it. I put this video together because Ark Raiders has this lore that almost nobody's talking about in any real depth. There are scattered documents, environmental storytelling, design choices baked into the world itself, and fragments of dialogue that, when you actually line them up, start to tell a story that is genuinely worth sitting with. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to lead with the world itself before moving into the factions and the machines, because I think understanding the setting first makes everything else land differently. I also made the decision to leave out a lot of pure speculation and focus on what the game actually points toward. So this is my interpretation. It is not the definitive canon. It is one reading of a very fragmented story. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The World Before Everything Broke. To understand where Ark Raiders drops you, you have to first understand where the world was before the machines came. The game does not hand you that history in a clean package. It leaves clues scattered across ruined buildings, in old text fragments, in the shape of structures that no longer serve any purpose. But those clues, taken together, suggest a world that was not so different from ours. The pre-Ark world, as the lore points toward, was recognizable. Cities, infrastructure, industries, governments, people going about lives that felt ordinary to them. One possible reading of the environmental storytelling is that the world had already been through several waves of significant technological change before the Ark arrived, which means the people living in it were not strangers to disruption. They had adapted before. They just had never adapted to anything like this. What the scattered records suggest is that there were early warning signs. There are fragments in the game that point toward unusual readings coming from orbit, signals that did not match any known satellite or debris pattern. Some of those readings appear to have been classified or minimized by whatever governing bodies still existed at the time. Whether that was incompetence, fear of public panic, or something more deliberate is something the lore does not clearly resolve. The world before the Ark fell had its own tensions. The environmental details suggest a society that was already fracturing in certain ways. Resource competition, technological inequality, and the kinds of pressures that come with a world that has been stretched thin in too many directions for too long. These details matter because they shape how people responded when things got bad, and they help explain why the post-Ark world looks the way it does. There is something quietly interesting in the way Ark Raiders frames this pre-existing fragility. It does not suggest that the Ark caused everything to collapse. It suggests that the Ark fell into a world that already had cracks running through it, and what the machines did was turn those cracks into chasms. The society that broke was already under pressure. The Ark just applied the final force. The cities that players move through in Ark Raiders are ruins now, but they were not always ruins. One reading of the architecture and infrastructure is that these were functional, reasonably prosperous settlements, apartment blocks, transit systems, commercial spaces, industrial facilities. The ordinary machinery of modern life, now corroded and repurposed by something that does not understand what any of it was built for. There are small details in the world design that point towards specific things that were happening in the years before the Ark arrived. Agricultural stress is one theme that appears in certain document fragments. Climate-related infrastructure projects show up in others. These are not random decorative choices. They suggest that the developers deliberately placed the Ark's arrival inside a world that was already grappling with serious problems, which makes the story feel grounded rather than purely fantastical. The people who lived in this world had names and faces and routines that we only glimpse through what they left behind. A note on a refrigerator, a work order on a clipboard, a piece of graffiti on a wall that predates the Ark. These fragments do not tell us everything, but they tell us enough to understand that the world the Ark destroyed was inhabited by people who had no idea what was coming and no framework for understanding it when it arrived. One possible reading of the pre-Ark world is that it had developed significant automated systems. The game's technology design suggests a society that was already deeply entangled with machine labor and automated logistics. This is worth noting because it means the people of this world were not afraid of machines in the abstract. They lived alongside them. They depended on them. The horror of the Ark is not just that machines arrived, but that the people of this world thought they understood machines, and the Ark proved they did not. The relationship between human technology and Ark technology is one of the more interesting tensions in the lore. They share certain visual and design languages, which the game appears to use deliberately. The suggestion seems to be that the Ark, whatever it is, has some relationship to human technological development that has not yet been fully explained. Whether it emerged from it, evolved alongside it, or arrived in response to it is one of the central mysteries that the lore points toward without resolving. Infrastructure tells stories. In Ark Raiders, the infrastructure of the pre-Ark world tells a story of ambition. These were not small communities, these were places built for scale, for permanence, for growth. The planning visible in the ruins suggests a society that believed in its own future. That belief makes the collapse feel more significant, not less. The bigger the ambition, the heavier the fall. There are hints in certain document fragments about research programs that were active in the years before the Ark arrived. The specifics are vague, deliberately so, but the general shape of them points toward projects dealing with orbital mechanics, signal interpretation, and long-range communication. One possible reading is that humanity was, in some form, reaching outward in the years before the Ark fell. Whether that reaching had anything to do with what arrived is a question the lore raises without answering. The social structures of the pre-Ark world are visible in the physical spaces the game puts you in. Wealth and poverty are both represented in the architecture. You move through spaces that were clearly built for different kinds of people, with different kinds of access and different kinds of safety. This layering suggests that the world was not uniform. When the Ark came, it did not fall on a unified civilization. It fell on a divided one. One thing the lore strongly suggests is that the government response to the early Ark arrival was chaotic and fragmented. Different regions appear to have received different information and different instructions. Some areas show signs of organized evacuation. Others show signs of complete abandonment. The absence of a coherent central response in the archaeology of the ruins is itself a piece of lore, pointing toward a society whose institutions were already struggling to function at the scale the crisis demanded. The pre-Ark world had its own mythology, its own art, its own ways of explaining things it did not understand. You can find traces of this in the game if you look carefully. Images, symbols, fragments of what were clearly cultural objects. The Ark's arrival did not erase this culture instantly. Culture is stubborn. It persists in corners and in memory. But the world those cultural objects were made for is gone, and what replaced it has no use for them. Seasons still came and went after the Ark arrived. The physical world did not stop turning. Rain still fell on the ruins. Plants still grew through the concrete. The natural world, indifferent to what the machines were doing, continued on its own schedule. This is a detail the game captures well in its environment design, and it is worth noting because it suggests that not everything was destroyed. The ground is still there. The sky is still there. What was destroyed was the particular arrangement of human life that had existed on top of those permanent things. There were people who survived the initial Ark arrival because they happened to be in the right places. underground structures, reinforced facilities, remote locations that the machines did not prioritize. Their survival was not heroism or preparation in most cases. It was geography and timing. The law does not romanticize survival. It presents it as something that happened to people as much as something people achieved. The initial months after the Ark's arrival, based on what the law suggests, were defined by confusion more than anything else. People did not know what the machines were, where they came from, what they wanted, or whether they could be stopped. The information networks that would have helped people make sense of the crisis were among the first things to go down, which means that people were left to interpret what they were seeing without any framework for understanding it. Food became the central problem very quickly. The pre-Ark world had a complex food supply infrastructure that was deeply dependent on systems that stopped working when the Ark arrived. Distribution networks, processing facilities, refrigeration, transportation. All of those systems collapsed or became inaccessible. The first winter after the Ark's arrival was, the law implies, extraordinarily brutal for everyone who survived it. The medical situation was similarly dire. Pre-Ark medicine was sophisticated, but also deeply dependent on supply chains and facilities that became unreachable or inoperable. Injuries that would have been routine to treat before became potentially fatal. Illnesses that had been manageable became dangerous again. The survivors of the Ark's arrival did not just face the threat of the machines, they faced the collapse of everything that had kept ordinary human vulnerability in check. Communities formed, broke apart, and reformed in the early period. The law suggests that the first social structures to emerge after the Ark were small and local, built around immediate needs and immediate trust. Ideology and institution came later. In the beginning, it was just people who were in the same place and needed each other to stay alive, which is an interesting foundation for the factions that eventually emerged. There is a layer of the pre-Ark world that the law only hints at, which is the experience of people who saw what was coming and tried to prepare. Not governments or institutions, but individuals and small groups who had been paying attention to the unusual signals and the strange readings and had begun quietly to make arrangements. These people had advantages in the early chaos that others did not, and some of them went on to play significant roles in what came after. The language of the pre-Ark world survives in the world of Ark raiders in interesting ways. Technical terminology, slang, place names, professional vocabulary. People still use these things because language does not vanish as quickly as infrastructure, but the contexts for those words have changed, and some of them have taken on new meanings that their original speakers would not recognize. This linguistic survival is a quiet form of continuity between the world that was and the world that is. One of the most evocative details in the environmental storytelling is the evidence of people who had clearly been in the middle of ordinary tasks when the Ark arrived. Half-finished meals, work projects interrupted at specific points, objects positioned as if someone put them down and intended to come back. These small frozen moments are deeply effective at communicating what it must have felt like to be in the world when it changed. The pre-Ark world also had its own conflicts, separate from anything the Ark did. Territorial disputes, political tensions, economic competition. The law does not present the pre-Ark world as a paradise that was destroyed by outside forces. It presents a complicated, imperfect world that was in the middle of its own struggles when a much larger and stranger struggle was imposed on it from above. Children who are very young when the Ark arrived and who are now young adults in the game's present represent an interesting segment of the population. They have no real memory of the world before. Everything they know about the pre-Ark world came to them second-hand, through older people who remembered it and through the physical remnants of it that they grew up among. Their relationship to that lost world is different from everyone else's, and the law points toward this distinction as being significant. The pre-Ark world had relationships with other parts of the world that are now essentially severed. Long-distance communication and travel that was routine before the Ark became impossible or extremely dangerous after. This isolation is significant because it means that different regions of the world have had completely different experiences of the Ark's arrival and its aftermath, and those different experiences have produced different cultures, different beliefs, and different strategies for survival. Water is one of the themes that runs quietly through the pre-Ark lore. Water systems, water storage, water access. The pre-Ark world had built elaborate systems for managing water, and the collapse of those systems was one of the earliest and most serious consequences of the Ark's arrival. Some of the early community formations that the lore points toward coalesced around water access, which shaped their character and their conflicts in ways that still echo in the present. There are fragments in the game that point towards specific professions and specializations that existed in the pre-Ark world. Engineers, doctors, teachers, technicians. What happened to those specializations in the aftermath is a thread that runs through the lore. Some of those skills became more valuable than ever. Others became nearly irrelevant. The ways in which professional identity survived or was transformed in the post-Ark world tells you a great deal about what the post-Ark world actually needed from people. The pre-Ark world had entertainment, games, music, stories, spectacle. The fragments of that entertainment culture that survive in the ruins are some of the more quietly affecting details in the game. A poster, a game cartridge, a music player with a dead battery. These objects carry with them the weight of a world that had enough stability and comfort to devote energy to pleasure and play, which is a kind of luxury that the post-Ark world does not easily afford. Religion and ritual existed in the pre-Ark world and did not disappear after the Ark arrived. If anything, the lore suggests that certain kinds of spiritual response intensified in the immediate aftermath. People reaching for frameworks to make sense of something that did not fit any existing category. The Ark was not something any existing religious tradition had prepared its followers to interpret, which left people constructing new meanings in real time. One reading of the pre-Ark period that the game's lore makes possible is that the world was approaching some kind of inflection point independently of the Ark's arrival. Environmental pressures, resource constraints, political fragmentation. The suggestion is not that the Ark saved the world from itself, or that the world was already doomed. The suggestion is more subtle than that. It is that the world was already in motion, and the Ark's arrival redirected that motion violently and completely. The pre-Ark world had a particular relationship with the sky that is worth thinking about. People looked up and saw stars, satellites, weather. The sky was navigable, mappable, knowable. The Ark's arrival changed the sky. After the Ark came, looking up meant something different. The sky became a source of threat. The familiar thing that people had lived under their whole lives became the direction from which danger descended. And that psychological shift in what the sky means is something the lore captures in the way it frames the Ark's ongoing presence above. Certain locations in the game show evidence of being significant in the pre-Ark world for reasons that are not immediately obvious. Places of meeting, places of transition, places that had specific cultural weight. The Ark did not destroy these places any differently than it destroyed anything else. The machines have no sense of the significance of a place. They interact with the physical world, not with the meanings that humans attach to it. This indifference is itself a kind of horror. The pre-Ark world had its own scientific understanding of the universe that did not include anything like the Ark in its models. The arrival of the machines was not just a physical catastrophe, it was an epistemological one. The tools and frameworks people had for understanding the world suddenly failed to account for one of the most significant things in it. That kind of rupture in what people know and how they know it has consequences that run deeper than the physical destruction. There are hints in the lore that certain governments or organizations had contingency plans for catastrophic events, but that those plans had been designed with different catastrophes in mind. Natural disasters, nuclear events, pandemics. The Ark was none of those things, and the contingency plans that had been designed to handle those kinds of events turned out to be poorly matched to what actually arrived. This mismatch between preparation and reality is a thread that runs through the early post-Ark period. Children born just before the Ark's arrival are an interesting demographic in the lore's framing. They have no memory of the world before, but they carry with them something that the older survivors carry differently, which is the grief of loss. The older survivors grieve something they remember and can compare to the present. The youngest survivors of that early period absorb the grief of others without the reference point of their own memory. That is a different kind of weight. The pre-Ark world had problems with loneliness, social fragmentation, digital mediation of human connection, the particular kind of isolation that comes with dense urban living. The Ark's arrival, in a dark irony, created conditions where loneliness became less of a problem for survivors, because survival required community and closeness in ways that the pre-Ark world had allowed people to avoid. The lore does not present this as a benefit. It is too costly to be called that. But it is a detail. Economic systems of the pre-Ark world left their mark on the physical environment in ways that are still visible in the ruins. The distribution of resources, the location of storage facilities, the design of commercial spaces. These economic geographies became survival geographies after the Ark arrived, because what mattered was where things were physically located, not what they cost. The old economic logic of the pre-Ark world became irrelevant almost overnight, which left certain populations in very different positions than they had occupied before. The pre-Ark world had a particular relationship with information that the post-Ark world does not share. Before the Ark, information was abundant, searchable, storable, instantly transmittable. After the Ark, information became scarce and local. What you knew was limited to what people around you knew and what physical records survived. This shift from information abundance to information scarcity shaped the post-Ark world in ways that the lore only partially explores, but the outlines of that shaping are visible in how factions organize and how power gets distributed. There were people in the pre-Ark world who did not live in cities. Rural communities, isolated settlements, people who had maintained different ways of living in relationship to the land. These people had a different experience of the Ark's arrival than urban populations did. Their infrastructure was less complex and therefore less catastrophically interruptible. Their food systems were more local. Their social bonds were different. The lore points toward this variation in experience without fully developing it, but the variation is there. The pre-Ark world had accumulated centuries of physical infrastructure that was, at the time of the Ark's arrival, still relatively functional. Roads, bridges, tunnels, foundations. The Ark did not destroy all of this immediately. The machines had their own priorities and their own patterns. What was destroyed quickly was destroyed for reasons related to those patterns. What was left alone for the same reason. The physical survivals of the pre-Ark world are not random. They reflect the Ark's behavior, and understanding that behavior is one of the ongoing projects of the survivors. Certain materials and manufacturing processes from the pre-Ark world have become critically important in the post-Ark context. Things that were considered mundane before, certain alloys, certain chemical compounds, certain electrical components, have taken on enormous significance because they are finite, because the capacity to produce them no longer exists, and because the Ark's machines require specific countermeasures that depend on them. The pre-Ark world was full of these things without knowing how precious they would become. The last generation of people to have complete memories of the pre-Ark world is aging in the game's present timeline. The law points toward this demographic shift as being significant, because with those people goes the living memory of what the world was like. Documents and records can preserve information, but they cannot preserve the texture of daily experience, the felt sense of what ordinary life was like before the machines came. As that living memory fades, the pre-Ark world becomes more mythological and less historical, and that transition matters for how people understand what they're fighting for. There is a question buried in the pre-Ark lore that the game does not answer directly, which is whether the world that existed before the Ark was worth returning to. Survivors who remember it tend to idealize it in ways that the physical evidence does not fully support. The pre-Ark world was not simply good. It was complicated, unequal, and in many ways troubled. The question of whether rebuilding means recovering the pre-Ark world or building something genuinely new is one of the tensions that runs through the factions and their competing visions. The pre-Ark world had its own heroes and villains, its own dramas and achievements, its own ongoing story. The Ark's arrival did not render all of that meaningless, but it did impose a new frame around it. In the post-Ark world, the pre-Ark world is often talked about in ways that flatten its complexity. It becomes a symbol of either what was lost or what should not be recovered, depending on who is doing the talking. The reality, as the lore quietly suggests, was more textured than either of those framings allows. What makes the pre-Ark world interesting as a lore foundation is not that it was special or exceptional. It is precisely that it was ordinary, a world of ordinary people, ordinary problems, ordinary ambitions, and ordinary failures. The Ark arrived not into a world preparing for something, but into a world simply continuing to be what it was. And that ordinariness, that absence of readiness, is what makes what happened to it so effective as a backdrop for everything the game asks you to engage with. Chapter 2. The Day the Ark Fell. The moment of the Ark's arrival is one of those events that the lore circles around without ever fully depicting in a single clear account. What we have instead are fragments, observations from people who were in different places and experienced the same event differently. The picture you get from piecing those fragments together is not a single dramatic moment. It is a collection of them, simultaneous and diverse. The first thing most accounts agree on is the light. Something changed in the sky that registered as light before it registered as anything else. Not a flash exactly, more of an alteration in the quality of ambient light that people noticed without immediately being able to identify it. The lore's fragments describe it as something that made people look up before they knew why they were looking up, which is a detail that suggests the light was unusual enough to trigger a kind of unconscious alertness. Then came the sound. The accounts vary here, which is part of what makes them interesting, as fragments of a larger event. Some describe a low, pervasive tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once rather than from any specific direction. Others describe something more like a pressure change than a sound, a sensation that preceded the auditory component. Some accounts describe silence, a sudden dampening of ordinary sound that was more alarming than noise would have been. The physical impact of the Ark's arrival on electronic systems happened quickly and comprehensively in most areas. Communications went down. Vehicle systems became unreliable or inoperable. Electrical infrastructure behaved erratically. The lore suggests that this was not a uniform experience across all areas simultaneously. There appear to have been zones where systems failed immediately and zones where the effect was delayed or partial. The reasons for this variation are part of the deeper mystery the lore points toward. The first sightings of actual Ark machines were, based on the fragments, disorienting in a way that went beyond simple fear. The accounts suggest that people initially had difficulty categorizing what they were seeing. The machines were clearly mechanical in some sense, but their movement and behavior did not match any mechanical category that people had available. There was something in the way the Ark moved that did not fit the expected movement of machines, and that wrongness was, many accounts suggest, the most immediately disturbing thing about them. The Ark did not arrive as a single unified event in the way that a conventional catastrophe does. It arrived as a process. The initial machines were followed by more. The initial areas of impact were expanded. It was not an explosion, but an inundation, gradual enough that people in some areas had days or weeks of relative normalcy before the Ark's presence became overwhelming in their location. This gradual spread shaped the nature of the human response, because it created information gradients. People in affected areas knew things that people in unaffected areas did not, and the transmission of that knowledge was difficult and uneven. One particular detail that several fragments point toward is the behavior of the Ark machines in those first hours. They were not immediately attacking everything they encountered. There appears to have been an initial period where the machines were more focused on something else, some kind of activity or assessment, before they began interacting violently with the human population and its infrastructure. What they were doing in that initial period is one of the questions the law raises without resolving, but the detail itself is significant. It suggests that the machines arrived with a specific purpose that preceded the destruction. Military responses to the Ark's arrival were, the law implies, largely ineffective, not for lack of effort. The fragments suggest that conventional military assets were deployed quickly in many areas, and that people in those areas initially felt something like hope when they saw organised armed responses being organised. But conventional weapons and conventional tactics had been designed against conventional threats, and the Ark was not a conventional threat. The ineffectiveness of the initial military response was not just a tactical failure, it was a signal about what the Ark actually was. The first deaths came quickly in areas where the machines were densest. The law does not dwell on this in graphic terms, but the scale is implied by the survivorship of the accounts we have. People who were in certain places when the Ark arrived did not survive to describe it. The accounts that exist are from people who were lucky in their geography, who were underground or in remote locations, or who were simply on the right side of a margin that was in many cases very narrow. There is a thread in the law about the experience of people who tried to help others in those first hours and days, people who went back into dangerous areas to pull out neighbours or family members, people who organised informal distribution of resources when the official systems failed, people who simply stayed visible and present when others were disappearing into fear and isolation. These people are not celebrated loudly in the law. They are present in the fragments as ordinary people doing things that happen to matter, which is a more honest representation than heroism usually gets. Communication between regions during the Ark's arrival was fragmentary and mostly one-directional. Some signals got through, most did not. People in areas that had not yet been reached by the Ark were receiving incomplete and often contradictory information about what was happening in areas that had been reached. This information environment, characterized by partial truths and significant gaps, shaped the decisions people made in those early hours in ways that often look, in retrospect, like terrible mistakes. Most of them were not mistakes in the information environment in which they were made. One reading of the Ark's arrival pattern is that it was deliberate in some way that we do not fully understand. The machines did not fall randomly. The areas of initial impact had something in common, though the law is not specific about what that something was. The suggestion is that the Ark selected its initial points of contact according to some logic that was meaningful to the Ark, and that we have not yet decoded. This purposefulness is more unsettling than randomness would have been. Children experience the Ark's arrival differently from adults in ways that the law hints at in small details. Some of the fragments are accounts by adults describing the experience through the lens of caring for children who are present, which is a perspective that adds a particular texture to the larger events. The need to manage fear and maintain normalcy for children while also responding to a crisis of incomprehensible scale is a specific kind of cognitive and emotional demand, and the fragments that capture it are some of the most affecting in the lore. Animals behaved unusually before and during the Ark's arrival in ways that some of the accounts document. This detail is interesting because it suggests that the Ark's presence had effects on the environment that preceded its visible manifestation. Animals are sensitive to kinds of stimuli that humans are not, and the reports of unusual animal behavior in the period before the Ark's machines became visible suggest that something was already happening before the human population had any awareness of it. The sky above areas where the Ark was densely present changed in observable ways during and after the arrival. The accounts describe variations in light quality, unusual atmospheric effects, and in some cases visible structures in the upper atmosphere that had not been there before. These changes were not just aesthetic. They appear to have had practical effects on navigation, on certain kinds of communication, and on the psychological experience of being in those areas. Looking up and seeing something fundamentally wrong with the sky is a particular kind of disorientation. There were people who had been in the process of travelling when the Ark arrived. In transit between places, on roads, in vehicles, in the air. Their experience of the event was different from people who were in stable locations when it happened. They were caught between places, without the relative shelter of buildings or communities, exposed in ways that people who happened to be at home were not. The lore has fragments from this population that are distinct in character from the accounts of people who experienced the arrival from within established locations. The economic and political institutions of the pre-Ark world did not all collapse simultaneously on the day the Ark arrived. Some of them persisted for longer than you might expect. Governments tried to continue functioning. Financial systems attempted to maintain some kind of operation. The slow collapse of these institutions in the weeks and months after the initial arrival is a lore thread that points toward the complexity of civilizational failure. It does not happen all at once. It happens in stages, with each stage producing its own specific kinds of loss and its own specific kinds of response. One of the things the lore suggests about the day the Ark arrived is that people's existing social relationships determined a great deal about what happened to them in those first hours. People who had strong local connections had access to networks of informal support and information that isolated individuals did not. The social infrastructure of the pre-Ark world, the relationships and community structures that people had built over time, became survival infrastructure on the day the Ark arrived. There are accounts in the lore fragments that describe the Ark's machines in ways that are consistent with each other, but also deeply strange. The accounts agree on certain physical characteristics, while also describing behaviours that do not follow from those characteristics in any way that makes mechanical sense. This strangeness is consistent across accounts from people who had no contact with each other, which suggests that the strangeness they were describing was real, rather than a product of individual confusion or fear. The fires that broke out in the areas most heavily affected by the Ark's arrival in the first days were, the lore suggests, both a direct consequence of the Ark's activity and an amplifier of everything else that was going wrong. The destruction of infrastructure, the displacement of populations, the impossibility of organised response. Fire was not the worst thing the Ark brought, but it was the most visible, immediate consequence in many areas, and it shaped the physical landscape that the survivors had to navigate in the aftermath. People who had technical expertise relevant to what was happening found themselves simultaneously valuable and unable to apply that expertise effectively. Engineers who could diagnose what was happening to electronic systems could not do anything to prevent it. Medical professionals who could treat injuries could not treat them at the scale that the scale of injury demanded. Scientists who could begin to observe and catalogue the Ark's behaviour had no means of converting those observations into action. The gap between understanding and capacity was a source of particular anguish for people who were used to their expertise being practically useful. One possible reading of certain law fragments is that there was more organised preparation for the Ark's arrival than the historical record makes obvious. Groups or individuals who had advanced knowledge of some kind and who used that knowledge to position themselves in ways that gave them advantages when the chaos began. This reading raises questions about what they knew, how they knew it, and what decisions they made about who to share that knowledge with. The law does not confirm this reading, but it does not contradict it either. The chaos of the Ark's arrival created both tragedy and, in smaller ways, unexpected opportunity. The collapse of existing hierarchies and structures freed some people who had been constrained by them. People who had been in disadvantaged positions within the pre-Ark world found that the rules that had governed their disadvantage no longer applied. This did not make the Ark's arrival a net positive for those people. The costs were too high and too universal, but it is a thread in the law that acknowledges the complexity of what happened. Night fell on the first day of the Ark's arrival in ways that were frightening in their own distinct way. Darkness and the Ark's machines were a particular combination, because darkness removed the visual information that people needed to monitor what the machines were doing and where they were going. The first nights after the Ark arrived were defined by sound and uncertainty in ways that the daylight hours were not. The law fragments that deal with those first nights have a specific texture that sets them apart from the rest. Rescue attempts in the early period, after the Ark's arrival, were disorganised and largely unsuccessful, not because of cowardice, but because the situation was genuinely, structurally impossible for organised rescue. The scale of need vastly exceeded any available capacity to respond. The institutions that would have organised rescue efforts were themselves compromised. The information about where help was needed was incomplete and unreliable. People tried anyway, and the law acknowledges this trying without overstating its effectiveness. There are fragments that describe the experience of watching the Ark's machines interact with the physical environment in ways that suggested intelligence, but that could not be decoded as purposeful in any way that made sense. The machines clearly knew what they were doing in some sense. They interacted with specific things and ignored others. They appeared to make decisions. But the logic of those decisions was opaque. What were they looking for? What were they building or destroying, and why? Those questions were unanswerable in the moment and have remained partially unanswerable since. The first communications about the Ark that were deliberately recorded for posterity rather than just transmitted for immediate use give us a particular window into how people were trying to make sense of what was happening in real time. These records, wherever they can be found in the game, show people attempting to use the analytical frameworks they had available, while those frameworks were visibly failing to account for what they were seeing. There is something both admirable and heartbreaking in watching people try to describe the unprecedented in the language of the already known. Water and food supply disruptions became critical very quickly after the Ark's arrival. The systems that delivered water to urban populations required functioning infrastructure, functioning power systems, and functioning logistics, and all of those things were failing simultaneously. The reality of what a water shortage means for a dense population under crisis conditions is something the law implies rather than describes directly, but the implication is severe enough. There are certain locations in the game that show evidence of having been gathering points in the immediate aftermath of the Ark's arrival, places where people came together spontaneously because they offered some combination of shelter, resources, or social presence. These gathering points became the seeds of post-Ark communities in some cases, and their character, whether they were organised around cooperation or around control, shaped the nature of the communities that grew from them. One of the stranger threads in the lore about the day the Ark arrived concerns the psychological effect of the machines on people who observed them closely. Some accounts describe something beyond fear, something more like a confrontation with a category of thing that the human mind was not organized to process. The machines were so different from anything in the existing conceptual landscape that encountering them at close range produced in some people something closer to a kind of cognitive shock than to ordinary fear. This detail is interesting because it suggests that the machine's effect on people was not just physical. The Ark's arrival changed what it meant to be an expert. Before the Ark, expertise was a function of accumulated knowledge in a specific domain. After the Ark arrived, the domains that expertise was organized around became partially or wholly irrelevant, while new domains of urgent importance emerged that nobody had expertise in. The people who adapted most quickly were often those who could move between domains, rather than those who were deepest in any one of them. And this shift in what kinds of intelligence were most valuable is reflected in the character types that the lore presents. Children separated from caregivers during the chaos of the Ark's arrival are a presence in the lore that the game handles carefully. They are not used as simple emotional props. The lore points toward the practical, logistical dimension of the problem as much as the emotional one. Children require care that adults under crisis conditions are often unable to provide, and the improvised care structures that developed in the immediate aftermath of the Ark's arrival shaped the social fabric of early survivor communities in ways that are still visible in the post-Ark world. One reading of the Ark's behavior during its initial arrival is that it was calibrating, not attacking randomly but gathering data, assessing the environment, the population, the infrastructure, and adjusting its subsequent behavior based on what it found. This reading would explain certain aspects of the Ark's behavior in the early period that do not make sense as pure aggression, but it also raises a more unsettling question. If the Ark was calibrating, what conclusion did it reach? And is the behavior we see now the result of a decision made on the basis of that early assessment? The physical sounds associated with the Ark's machines became, for survivors, a powerful conditioned stimulus very quickly. Sounds that had been meaningless before became signals of immediate danger, and the psychological consequences of that conditioning are visible in the behavior of survivors in the game's present. People who are hypervigilant, who process certain sounds with a speed and intensity that suggests deep conditioning rather than conscious thought. The trauma of the Ark's arrival is not just remembered. In many cases, it is still active. There is a thread in the lore about the experience of organized groups, military units, first responder teams, who attempted to maintain their cohesion and their operational function through the chaos of the Ark's arrival. Most of those groups eventually fragmented, but not immediately. Some maintained function for days or weeks, and the way they are functioned during those days, what decisions they made, and why, left marks on the post-Ark landscape that are still visible. The operational choices of those early organized groups seeded certain aspects of the factions that came later. The day the Ark arrived was experienced differently by people depending on where they happened to be, who they happened to be with, and what they happened to know. There is no single account of the Ark's arrival that captures all of those experiences. The lore acknowledges this by presenting the day as a collection of fragments, rather than a single narrative, and that fragmentation is not a weakness. It is the truth of how large events are actually experienced. No two people who lived through it have the same story. Faith was tested and transformed on the day the Ark arrived. People who had organized their understanding of existence around specific religious or spiritual frameworks found those frameworks under sudden and severe pressure. Some found that their faith adapted and survived the pressure. Some found that it did not. Some found that the crisis deepened their faith rather than challenging it, and some found that the Ark's arrival led them toward entirely new spiritual formulations that had no precedent in any pre-Ark tradition. All of these responses are present in the lore. The physical evidence that the Ark's arrival left on the landscape is still there in the game's present. Scorch patterns, structural deformations, unusual mineral deposits, changes in soil composition. The world the Ark arrived into still carries the marks of that arrival in ways that are readable to people who know what they are looking at. Environmental storytelling in Ark Raiders is partly the storytelling of these marks, and learning to read them is part of what the game teaches you as you move through its world. One detail that the lore hints at without developing fully is the response of the broader non-human natural world to the Ark's arrival. Not just the behavioural changes in animals that preceded it, but the longer-term ecological responses, species that moved or declined or expanded in the post-Ark environment, plants that colonised the ruins in particular patterns. The broader ecology of the world responding to the arrival of something that the ecology had no prior relationship with. This thread is underdeveloped in the explicit lore, but is visible in the environmental design. In the first 48 hours after the Ark arrived, certain patterns of the machine's behaviour became visible to careful observers. Not fully interpretable, but visible. Where the machines went, how they moved, what they prioritised, what they avoided. People who survived the early period largely did so because they adapted to those patterns even without understanding them. Survival in the immediate post-Ark world required a kind of practical intelligence that worked without theoretical understanding, adjusting behaviour based on observed patterns rather than on any ability to explain those patterns. The human experience of time was disrupted by the Ark's arrival in ways that the lore captures in several of its fragments. The normal markers of time, regular schedules, working days, social routines became unavailable. Without those markers, time became formless and difficult to track. Accounts from survivors describe the early post-Ark period as feeling both very long and very compressed, with days that felt endless, while weeks passed without being registered. This temporal disorientation added to the broader disorientation of the crisis in ways that had practical consequences for decision-making and for psychological stability. The question of what to take and what to leave behind was one that faced almost everyone who attempted to move in the chaos of the Ark's arrival. What physical objects were worth carrying? What records were worth preserving? What was practically valuable? And what was emotionally significant but practically useless? The choices people made in those moments are visible in what the game's world contains. The things that were carried and the things that were abandoned tell you something about what people thought mattered most when they were forced to choose. Chapter 3. What the Ark actually is. The central mystery of Ark Raiders is not really about survival or faction politics, or even the post-apocalyptic world that the game takes place in. The central mystery is what the Ark is. The game does not answer this directly. It gives you evidence and lets you work with it, which is both the most honest approach to a genuinely open question and the most engaging one from a storytelling perspective. The most basic observable fact about the Ark is that it is mechanical. The machines that comprise it are constructed things. They have components, structures, materials that are recognizable as engineered rather than naturally occurring. Whatever the Ark is at the highest level, it expresses itself in the physical world through machines that were made, not grown. This seems like a simple starting point, but it has implications that ripple out in interesting directions. One reading of the Ark's mechanical nature is that it originated from a technological civilization of some kind. Machines do not appear spontaneously. They are made by something with the intention of making them. The question of what made the Ark's machines and for what purpose is one of the lore's deep threads. The game points toward this question without answering it, but the direction of the pointing is itself informative. The materials that the Ark's machines are made from are one source of evidence about their origin. Some of those materials are consistent with Earth-derived manufacturing, others are not. This mixture is interesting because it suggests that either the Ark has incorporated Earth materials into itself over time, or that the civilization that created the Ark had access to similar materials from a different source, or that the Ark and human technology share some common origin that the lore has not yet revealed. All three possibilities have different implications for the larger story. The behaviour of the Ark's machines is the most studied aspect of the Ark, and also the most mysterious. The machines appear to be purposeful. They move with intention. They prioritise certain targets and ignore others. They respond to environmental conditions in ways that suggest awareness. But the purpose behind that behaviour is not something that any survivor has been able to decode into a clear statement. The machines know what they're doing. Nobody else does. One possible reading of the Ark's behaviour patterns is that the machines are executing a program, a set of instructions given to them by whatever created them, instructions that continue to run regardless of circumstances. This reading would explain the relentlessness of the Ark and its apparent indifference to the consequences of its actions. A program does not care about consequences. It executes its instructions until those instructions are complete, or until the system running them fails. Neither of those endpoints is visible in the game's present. Another possible reading is that the Ark is genuinely intelligent in a way that is not reducible to programming. That the machines are not executing fixed instructions, but are making decisions, evaluating situations, and adapting their behaviour based on something that functions like judgment. This reading is supported by certain behaviours that seem too contextually responsive to be purely programmatic, but it raises the question of what kind of intelligence would behave the way the Ark behaves, and whether intelligence is even the right word for it. The relationship between individual Ark machines and the Ark as a larger system is one of the more interesting structural questions the lore raises. Do the individual machines operate independently, or are they part of a coordinated collective system? The evidence is mixed. Individual machines show behaviours that suggest local decision-making, but the overall patterns of the Ark's activity suggest coordination at a scale that would require something more than local decision-making. The lore points towards some kind of distributed intelligence without specifying its architecture. One detail that several lore fragments point toward is the Ark's apparent ability to learn. Not in a way that mimics human learning exactly, but in the sense that its behaviour changes over time in ways that suggest it is incorporating information about the environment and adjusting accordingly. Tactics that worked against the Ark early in the post-arrival period became less effective over time. Strategies that the Ark found difficult to counter were countered more effectively as time passed. Whether this is genuine learning or a very sophisticated adaptive program is a distinction the lore does not resolve. The Ark's interaction with electronic systems is one of the more practically significant aspects of its nature. The Ark appears to have a specific relationship with electronic systems that is more active than mere interference. In some cases, the lore suggests the Ark can interact with and in some sense read certain kinds of electronic systems. This capability is both a threat and a source of information because it implies that the Ark is interested in electronic information in a way that goes beyond simply disrupting it. There is a thread in the lore about the question of whether the Ark is singular or plural. Is the Ark one thing or many things? The name itself implies a singular entity, which suggests that at some level the Ark's machines are not independent actors, but expressions of a single larger system. But the practical reality of interacting with the Ark in the game is that you interact with individual machines that behave in ways that are locally variable. The tension between the singular and the plural is built into the ark's design at multiple levels. The question of the ark's origin is impossible to fully separate from the question of what the ark is. If the ark came from somewhere specific, that origin would tell us something about the context in which it was created and the purpose for which it was made. The law suggests orbital origin, a descent from above, but above what? The law is deliberately vague about whether the ark originated in Earth orbit, from somewhere else in the solar system, or from farther away. Each of those possibilities implies a different story. One reading that some law fragments make possible is that the ark is not an alien intelligence in the conventional sense, but rather a technology of some kind that became independent. A system that was created with a specific purpose, and that, at some point, began to pursue that purpose in ways that were not intended by whoever created it. This reading places the ark in a category alongside other technological horror stories, systems that do exactly what they were designed to do in conditions their designers did not anticipate. The ark's physical construction is something that the game allows you to observe closely, and those observations suggest sophistication that is not entirely foreign. The structural logic of the machines has elements that are recognizable as engineering, even if the specific solutions are novel. This recognizability is part of what makes the ark uncanny, rather than simply alien. It is close enough to familiar to be readable as a kind of engineering, while being different enough from anything that the pre-ark world produced to be deeply strange. The relationship between the ark and the concept of self-preservation is interesting. The machines clearly defend themselves when threatened. They also, the law suggests, prioritize their own continuity in ways that affect their tactical behavior. But whether this constitutes something like self-preservation in a meaningful sense or is simply a programmatic defense function is a distinction the law leaves open. The difference matters because self-preservation implies something about the nature of the system doing the preserving. One possible reading of the ark's overall purpose is that it is resource-oriented, that the machines are engaged in some kind of extraction or processing activity, and that the destruction they cause is a byproduct of that activity rather than the activity itself. This reading is supported by certain behavioral patterns that suggest the machines are more interested in certain materials and certain structures than in active conflict. The violence of the ark in this reading is instrumental rather than intentional. The sensory apparatus of the ark's machines is something that survivors have had to study carefully for practical reasons. Understanding what the machines can detect and how they detect it is essential to the survival strategies of anyone who moves through ark-affected territory. The law suggests that the machines have detection capabilities that are in some ways superior to human senses and in other ways differently organized, which means that human intuitions about what constitutes concealment do not always translate into effective concealment from the ark. There is a thread in the law about the possibility that the ark communicates in some sense, not necessarily in a way that is interpretable by humans, but in a way that is interpretable by other ark machines. The question of what the machines are communicating, how they are communicating it, and whether that communication could ever be decoded by humans is one of the law's more open threads. The possibility of decoding ark communication is implied to be significant in ways the law does not yet specify. The ark's relationship with time is another thread worth following. The machines do not appear to be in a hurry in the way that a military force pursuing a strategic objective would be. Their activities continue steadily without the fluctuations in intensity that would suggest they are responding to a deadline or a schedule. This patience, if that is the right word for it, suggests either that the ark's objective is very long-term or that the concept of urgency does not apply to whatever the ark is doing. Neither of those possibilities is comforting. One reading of the ark that the law makes possible is that what we are seeing is not the whole of it. that the machines visible on and near the Earth's surface are one component of a much larger system that extends beyond the planet's atmosphere, that the full extent of the Ark is something that the survivors have no way of perceiving, let alone understanding. This reading is consistent with the way the law frames the Ark's arrival as a descent, implying that what descended was a portion of something larger that remained above. The question of whether the Ark can be destroyed is one that the practical experience of survivors has partially answered. Individual machines can be disabled and destroyed. This is the operational foundation of everything the Raiders do. But whether the Ark as a system can be meaningfully damaged, whether destroying enough machines would eventually defeat the Ark in some meaningful sense, is a question the law has not answered. The machines keep coming. The implication is that there is more where they came from. One detail that points in an interesting direction is the Ark's apparent interest in certain human structures and technologies. Not all of them equally. Certain things seem to attract the Arky's machines, and certain things seem to be ignored. The pattern of that interest, if it can be decoded, might tell you something about what the Ark is looking for or trying to accomplish. People in the game world have been trying to decode that pattern for a long time, with partial success and ongoing disagreement about what the pattern means. The materials left behind by destroyed Ark machines are one of the most practically important aspects of the Ark's nature. These materials have properties that make them useful in ways that require understanding what they are and how they work. The study of Ark materials is one of the ongoing projects of the post-Ark world, and what has been learned from that study is part of the operational intelligence that the Raiders draw on. But the study also raises questions. The more you understand about how the materials work, the more questions you have about how they were made. There is a question about whether the Ark experiences anything that could be called a goal. The machines behave purposefully, which implies something goal-like is directing them. But goals in any sense we would recognize as meaningful implies something that the law is careful not to assert, which is a subject behind the Ark that has interests that can be satisfied or frustrated. Whether the Ark has interests in any meaningful sense or whether it simply executes processes is one of the deeper philosophical questions the law raises without answering. The Ark's relationship with the biological world is another thread. The machines do not appear to be indifferent to living things, but their interest in living things is different from their interest in built structures and materials. The law suggests that the Ark interacts with biological systems in specific and interesting ways that are still being understood. What those interactions mean for the longer-term relationship between the Ark and the ecology of the post-Ark world is something the law points toward without resolving. One possible reading of the Ark's presence as a long-term phenomenon is that it is not trying to destroy the Earth, but to change it. That the processes the machines are engaged in are transformative rather than simply destructive. This reading reframes the Ark from a destroyer to something more like an agent of change, which does not make it any less dangerous to human survival, but does imply a different kind of relationship between the Ark's activity and the future of the world. If the Ark is changing something rather than simply destroying it, the question becomes, changing it into what? The Ark machines show variability in their design that the law points toward as significant. They are not all identical. There are types and subtypes, machines that appear to be specialized for different functions. This specialization implies a designed system, one where different components have different roles within a larger structure. Understanding that structure, the functional relationships between different types of Ark machines, is something that the Raiders and the factions of the post-Ark world have been working on with significant practical urgency. The question of consciousness is one that the law raises implicitly through the way it describes the Ark's behavior. The machines behave in ways that suggest awareness and responsiveness. Whether that constitutes consciousness in any philosophically meaningful sense is a question that the lore, wisely, does not try to answer definitively. But the fact that the question comes up naturally in trying to describe the ark's behavior is itself a piece of information about how the ark experiences, or does not experience, the world. One thread that runs through the lore about the ark's nature is the difficulty of maintaining scientific rigor in studying something that is also actively trying to destroy you. The people who are most positioned to observe the ark closely are those who are most at risk from it. This creates a specific epistemological problem. The knowledge base about the ark is built from observations made under conditions of extreme stress and danger, which introduces all kinds of potential errors and biases into the data. The lore acknowledges this limitation, which makes the existing knowledge base more interesting rather than less. The ark's apparent indifference to human suffering is one of the things that makes it most alien. Not cruelty exactly. Cruelty implies awareness of suffering and a decision to cause it anyway. What the ark exhibits is something closer to indifference, a simple absence of any processing of human experience as a relevant input. The machines are not cruel, they are something more unsettling than cruel. They are simply operating according to their own logic in a way that happens to be incompatible with human survival. There are certain observations about the ark's machines that suggest they are not operating at their full capacity, that what we are seeing is constrained or limited in some way that we do not understand. If this reading is correct, it raises an uncomfortable question about what the ark would look like if those constraints were removed. The law does not confirm this reading, but it does not rule it out, and the question it raises is worth sitting with. One possible reading of the ark that draws on several lore fragments is that it is something like an immune system, a system designed to identify and respond to something specific, now operating in an environment where that specificity has become generalized or has been lost. In this reading, the ark arrived not to destroy humanity specifically, but to respond to something, and its impact on humanity is a consequence of its response logic rather than its intention. This reading does not make the ark less dangerous, but it does make it less malevolent in a way that is interesting. The ark's machines do not appear to decay in the way that organic or even most mechanical systems do. They maintain themselves, or they are maintained by the system they are part of. This maintenance capability is one of the things that makes the ark a sustained and ongoing threat, rather than a crisis that peaked and then diminished. The machines in the game's present are not the degraded remnants of something that arrived in the past. They are, in some sense, still arriving, still active, still present in a way that organic threats simply cannot sustain. The relationship between the ark and the concept of territory is interesting. The ark does not appear to have territorial behavior in the way that a nation or an organism does. It does not claim or defend space in any consistent way. It interacts with space in ways that are driven by whatever its internal logic dictates, which produces distributions of ark presence that do not map onto any conventional territorial model. Understanding the ark's spatial distribution is one of the practical challenges the raiders face, because conventional notions of safe and unsafe territory do not translate cleanly into the ark's presence patterns. One reading of the ark's history on Earth, if history is the right word for something that may have no subjective sense of its own past, is that it has changed since the initial arrival. Not fundamentally, but in ways that suggest the initial phase of its presence was different from the ongoing phase. The ark of the early post-arrival period behaved somewhat differently from the ark of the game's present, and the reasons for that change are part of the lore's open questions. The ark's interaction with human attempts to understand it is itself a topic within the lore. Researchers and analysts who have tried to study the ark have sometimes found that the ark appears to respond to being studied in ways that are not consistent with a purely passive subject of study. Whether this is genuine awareness of being observed or simply a mechanical response to the stimuli associated with being observed is an open question. But the experience of studying the ark and having the ark seem to respond to the study is a thread in several law fragments. What the ark does to the landscape over extended time is another thread. The areas where the ark has been present for the longest time show changes in their physical environment that go beyond simple structural damage. Soil composition, atmospheric chemistry, the organization of certain materials in certain ways. These changes suggest that the ark's activity has effects that accumulate over time and that modify the environment in ways that may be permanent. The long-term ecological implications of sustained ark presence are one of the darker threads in the law. One thing the law suggests about the ark is that it does not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants in any way that is meaningful to human ethics. The ark does not have a concept of non-combatant immunity. It interacts with what it encounters according to its own logic, not according to any framework of proportionality or distinction that human warfare has developed. This absence of ethical distinction is not cruelty, it is simply the absence of the moral framework within which cruelty is a meaningful category. The question of whether the ark can be negotiated with or communicated with is one that the law raises implicitly in several places. The practical consensus among the survivors is that the ark cannot be negotiated with in any conventional sense, but there are hints in the law that some people have tried, and that the results of those attempts were not simply null. Something happened when those attempts were made. What happened is not clearly stated, but the law's references to those attempts suggest they were neither immediately lethal nor successful in any straightforward sense. What the ark ultimately is remains the central open question of the law. The game gives you enough evidence to form interesting interpretations without giving you enough to settle on a definitive answer. This openness is, at least in this reading, deliberate. The mystery of the ark's nature is not a placeholder for a reveal that has not yet happened. It is the actual character of the thing. The ark is genuinely mysterious in a way that the world it arrived in may never fully understand. And sitting with that mystery, rather than waiting to solve it, is part of what the game is asking you to do. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Survival. When the ark arrived and the pre-ark world collapsed, the people who survived faced an immediate and absolute version of a very old problem. How do you stay alive when the systems you depend on are gone? The solutions that people found, improvised, and refined in the early post-ark period form what you might call the architecture of survival, the physical and social structures that made ongoing human life possible in an ark-affected world. The first structure of survival was geographic. You had to be somewhere, not just anywhere, but somewhere with specific physical properties, somewhere that offered shelter from the elements, some degree of concealment from the machines, and some proximity to resources. Finding those places was the first project of survival, and the places that were found became the seeds of everything that came after. Underground was an early and obvious direction. The ark's machines were not absent from underground environments, but they were less prevalent there in the early period, and the physical properties of underground spaces offered both concealment and structural protection that surface structures often did not. The earliest organised survivor communities in many areas were underground, and the experience of those communities shaped the culture of survival in ways that are still visible in the game's present. Water was the second determinant of settlement location. Human beings cannot survive long without fresh water, and the distribution of usable water sources in the post-ark world was highly uneven. The collapse of water treatment and distribution infrastructure meant that communities had to be near sources of water that could be used without that infrastructure. Natural springs, wells, rivers, and streams that had not been contaminated. These water sources became the anchors around which communities organised. Food was the third and most complex element of the survival architecture. The pre-Ark world's food system was intricate and globally networked, and almost all of it became inaccessible or non-functional after the Ark's arrival. The survivors had to construct food production systems under conditions of extreme stress, with limited resources and ongoing Ark threat, at a time when most of the people doing the work had no practical experience with food production. The results were imperfect, but functional enough to allow communities to persist. Security was the fourth element, and it interacted with all the others in complex ways. Security meant protection from the Ark's machines, but it also very quickly came to mean protection from other human beings. The collapse of legal and institutional structures that had previously governed conflict between humans meant that conflict could occur in whatever forms and at whatever scales the parties to the conflict could sustain. Security was both a physical project and a social one, and the two versions of it required different but related solutions. The physical security measures that early communities developed were shaped by what they had available and what they were defending against. The Ark's machines had specific capabilities and specific patterns, and effective security measures needed to account for those specific things rather than for some generic threat. Learning what worked against the Ark and what did not was a costly process, because the experiments that failed had consequences that could not always be recovered from. The social architecture of survival was in many ways as important as the physical architecture. Communities needed ways to make decisions, to allocate resources, to resolve conflicts, to maintain the kinds of cooperation that survival required. The social structures that emerged in the early post-Ark period were diverse, reflecting the diversity of circumstances in which they were built. Some were relatively egalitarian, some were hierarchical, some were built around specific skills or resources that gave their holders disproportionate power. Knowledge became one of the most important resources in the post-Ark world. What you knew about the Ark's machines, about the local terrain, about where resources were located, about how to repair and maintain equipment, about medicine, about food production. Knowledge that had been freely available in the pre-Ark world through internet access and institutional infrastructure became scarce and locally distributed. The people who held relevant knowledge held power, and the structures that accumulated and transmitted knowledge became central to community survival. The role of specialists in early survivor communities is one of the threads the lore develops in interesting ways. Before the Ark, specialization had been possible because of the scale and complexity of the pre-Ark world's division of labor. After the Ark, communities were too small and too resource-constrained for deep specialization in most areas. People had to be broadly capable in ways that the pre-Ark world had not required. But certain specializations remained valuable enough to justify the costs of maintaining them, and the people who held those specializations occupied particular roles in their communities. The relationship between communities in the early post-Ark period was defined by a mix of cooperation and conflict that was different from what you might expect. Communities that were too close to each other competed for resources, but communities that were too far from each other could not support each other in the ways that isolation demanded. The spatial logic of community relationships in the post-Ark world produced a specific kind of tension between proximity and distance, cooperation and competition. That shaped the political landscape of the survivor world. Tools and the capacity to make and maintain them were among the most significant practical determinants of survival. A community that could maintain its tools had capabilities that a community that could not maintain its tools rapidly lost. The people who could work with metal, who could repair mechanical systems, who could fabricate components when they were needed, were among the most practically valuable members of any community. The workshops and workspaces where this work happened became important community infrastructure. The Ark left behind materials and components when its machines were damaged or destroyed, and these materials were recognized early on as valuable resources. They had properties that pre-Ark materials did not, and learning to work with them was a project that occupied significant intellectual and practical energy in the early post-Ark period. Some of what was learned about those materials became the basis for post-Ark technology development. Some of it remained mysterious or dangerous to work with. Medical capability in early survivor communities was limited by the availability of supplies, the presence of people with relevant knowledge, and the conditions under which medical care had to be provided. Injuries that came from Ark encounters were different from ordinary injuries in ways that required specific knowledge to treat. Disease became a significant threat when the pre-Ark world's public health infrastructure collapsed. The communities that managed to maintain some level of medical capability had survival advantages that compounded over time. The question of what to teach children was one that early communities had to confront quickly. What knowledge and skills were most important to transmit? What from the pre-Ark world was worth preserving, and what was no longer relevant? How to balance the transmission of existing knowledge with the development of new knowledge suited to the new conditions. These questions were not abstract. They were practical and urgent, and the answers different communities arrived at shaped the character of those communities in lasting ways. The emotional and psychological architecture of survival is a thread that the law handles more quietly than the physical architecture, but it is there. People needed not just food, shelter, and security, but also meaning, connection, and some sense of purpose that went beyond immediate survival. The communities that managed to provide those things, alongside the material necessities of survival, were more stable and more functional than those that did not. The human need for meaning did not disappear because the world had become dangerous. It remained and required responses. Ritual and ceremony developed in early survivor communities as practical tools for social cohesion as much as expressions of genuine belief. Shared practices that created community identity and marked significant events gave people ways to locate themselves in relation to each other and in relation to time. The specific forms these practices took varied enormously between communities, but the fact of their emergence was consistent. People needed rituals, and they created them even in conditions of extreme material constraint. The transmission of the Ark's arrival story, from those who had lived through it to those who had not, was itself a significant social project. How to tell that story, what to emphasize, what it meant, what it implied about the future. These questions were answered differently in different communities, and the narratives that emerged from those different answers shaped the collective identities and the political orientations of the communities in ways that eventually contributed to the factional landscape of the game's present. Children born after the Ark's arrival were the first members of a generation that had no personal experience of the pre-Ark world. Their relationship to that world was shaped entirely by what adults told them and by the physical environment they grew up in. The way communities chose to present the pre-Ark world to these children as a paradise lost, as a flawed world that the Ark destroyed, as a warning about what not to repeat, reflected and reinforced the community's own orientations toward the past and toward the future. The question of authority was a live and often contested one in early survivor communities. Before the Ark, authority had been vested in institutions, roles, laws, and norms that had accumulated over long periods of social development. After the Ark, most of those institutions and laws were gone, and authority had to be reconstituted from scratch in conditions that did not favour any single model. The variety of authority structures that emerged in the early post-Ark period is one of the most sociologically interesting aspects of the law. Trade and exchange between communities began as soon as communities were stable enough to engage in it, which was relatively early. Communities that had different resources and different capabilities had reasons to exchange with each other, and the networks of trade that developed connected communities in ways that built relationships, created interdependencies, and eventually formed the basis for some of the larger organizational structures that came later. The economics of the post-Ark world were, from the beginning, embedded in social relationships in a way that the pre-Ark world's economics had partially obscured. The survivors of the initial Ark arrival had an authority in their communities that derived simply from having been there, having seen the Ark arrive, having made it through the worst. This authority was not uniform. Some people who had lived through the early period were not leaders and were not looked to for guidance. But the experience of the early period was a shared credential among those who had it, and people who lacked that experience related to those who had it in specific ways. The physical organization of early survivor settlements tells you a great deal about what those communities prioritized, where they placed their most critical resources, how they organized their defensive perimeters, where they put their medical facilities, their food storage, their community meeting spaces. The spatial logic of those settlements encoded their values and their threat assessments in ways that are readable in the game's archaeological approach to its world. Ark encounters, the direct confrontations between survivor communities and the Ark's machines, were a constant background pressure on the architecture of survival. Every community that survived long enough had to develop a set of practices for handling Ark encounters, for managing the aftermath of those encounters, for learning from them and adjusting. The communities that developed effective Ark encounter protocols survived longer and more stably than those that did not. The raiders of the game's present are one product of that long process of developing Ark encounter expertise. The relationship between the early survivor communities and the environment they were living in is one of the more interesting threads in the lore. People who had lived in cities and suburbs before the Ark had no deep relationship with their non-human environment. After the Ark, that relationship became unavoidable. The natural world was both a resource and a threat, and developing a practical understanding of it was a survival necessity. The communities that managed to develop that understanding more quickly had advantages over those that did not. Communication between distant communities was one of the most persistent technical challenges of the post-Ark world. The Ark's presence interfered with many conventional communication technologies, and the infrastructure that had supported long-distance communication in the pre-Ark world was largely inaccessible. Communities developed various workarounds, some technological, some not, and the communities that successfully maintained communication networks with other communities had survival advantages that compounded over time. The concept of borders and belonging was reinvented in the early post-Ark period in ways that were both similar to and different from pre-Ark social identity. Communities developed identity markers and membership criteria that defined who was inside and who was outside. These markers and criteria were diverse in their form and their logic, but they served a common function of creating the kind of bounded social trust that cooperation requires. The communities that got this balance right, inclusive enough to grow but bounded enough to maintain trust, were more stable than those that did not. Scarcity shaped everything about the architecture of survival in ways that would be familiar from other historical contexts of extreme resource limitation, but that had specific features in the post-Ark context. The Ark was both a threat and a source of materials. The ruins of the pre-Ark world were both a danger and a supply of essential resources. Navigating the relationship between scarcity, danger, and opportunity was the central practical challenge of post-Ark survival, and the strategies that communities developed for navigating it defined their characters. The Ark Raiders themselves, as a concept, emerge from this architecture of survival. They are not simply soldiers or scavengers, though they are both of those things in a functional sense. They are the product of a specific post-Ark logic that recognized that survival required active engagement with a dangerous environment, that the resources needed to sustain human life in the post-Ark world were located in places that required courage and skill to reach, and that the people who had those qualities were a community resource worth developing and supporting. Chapter 5. The Raiders and why they fight the Raiders are, in the most basic functional sense, the people who go outside, who go into Ark-affected territory, into the ruins of the pre-Ark world, into the dangerous places where the machines are concentrated, to bring back what their communities need to survive. That is the simple version. The more interesting version is about why they do it and what it costs them and what it means in the larger context of the post-Ark world. The decision to become a raider is not a simple one in the world of Ark Raiders. It is not military service with a clear institutional structure behind it. It is a more personal decision informed by a combination of necessity, capability, and something harder to name that the law consistently points toward as a significant part of what makes someone a raider rather than just a desperate person with a weapon. Raiders exist because the communities they serve need them to exist. The resources that keep those communities alive, materials, medicine, technology, food, are located in places that are dangerous to access. The people who are willing and able to go to those places and come back with what is needed are not expendable by definition. They are essential infrastructure. But the relationship between raiders and their communities is not simply transactional, and the law is careful to present it as something more complex than that. The skills that raiders need are specific and significant. The ability to move quietly through dangerous environments, the ability to assess Ark machine behavior and navigate around it, the ability to make decisions under pressure without the luxury of deliberation, the ability to maintain operational effectiveness while managing fear. These skills are not innate. They are developed through training and through experience, and the experience component is the most important and the most costly. The raiders of the game's present are not the first generation. There were people in the early post-Ark period who began doing what raiders do before the word existed, before there was any organized framework around the activity. Those early people developed the basic, operational knowledge that was passed down to subsequent generations. Their accumulated practical intelligence is the foundation of what raiders know today, even if most current raiders have no direct personal connection to those early figures. The relationship between raiders and death is one of the law's recurring themes. Raiders die. Not all of them, not always, but with enough frequency that every raider has lost people, has attended the end of someone who was doing what they do. The way raiders and the communities around them handle this aspect of the work tells you a great deal about the culture of the post-Ark world and about what death means in a context where it is present enough to be almost normalized but not so common as to be meaningless. There is a tension in the raider identity between individual capability and collective purpose. Raiders have to be individually highly capable. The work demands it, but the purpose of that individual capability is collective. The things raiders bring back serve communities, not just themselves. Managing that tension, maintaining individual motivation and excellence while keeping collective purpose central is one of the ongoing challenges of the raider life, and one of the ongoing projects of the communities that support raiders. The equipment that raiders use is one of the more tangible manifestations of the post-Ark world's material culture. It is a mix of pre-Ark technology that has been maintained and modified, post-Ark technology developed from scratch using available materials, and Ark-derived technology that has been adapted for human use. Each category carries its own implications and its own stories. The pre-arc equipment speaks to continuity with the world that was. The post-arc equipment speaks to the creativity and ingenuity of the survivor culture. The arc-derived equipment speaks to the specific and uncomfortable intimacy that the post-arc world has developed with the thing that is trying to destroy it. Raiders often operate in small groups rather than individually. This is partly a practical matter. The work is safer with multiple people, but it is also a social matter. The intensity of raider work creates strong bonds between people who do it together, and those bonds are not simply a byproduct of shared danger. They are a meaningful part of the raider identity and culture. The people you go out with are the people who have your life in their hands and whose lives you hold in turn. That creates a relationship that has no real equivalent in the pre-arc world. The decision-making process in raider groups under operational conditions is one of the law's practical interests. When things go wrong in arc-affected territory, decisions have to be made quickly, with incomplete information, with significant consequences for error. The frameworks that experienced raiders use to make those decisions are not written down anywhere. They are carried in the body and the nervous system of people who have been doing the work long enough to have developed the relevant reflexes. What raiders find in the ruins is not just material, it is also information. Documents, recordings, physical evidence of what the pre-arc world was and what happened to it. Some raiders treat this informational dimension of their work as secondary, focused primarily on the material resources that are the explicit purpose of their operations. Others treat it as significant in its own right, understanding that the knowledge preserved in the ruins is itself a resource that the post-arc world needs, even if it is less immediately practical than food or medicine. The emotional experience of moving through the ruins is something the law addresses in ways that are low-key but consistent. For raiders who grew up in the post-arc world, the ruins are simply the landscape they work in. For those who are old enough to remember the pre-arc world, moving through the ruins means moving through their own past. The apartment blocks, the commercial spaces, the transit infrastructure. These things were alive with human activity when they were young, and now they are silent and dangerous. That experience is a specific kind of grief that does not have a name. The relationship between raiders and the factions of the post-arc world is complicated and varies depending on which factions are in question and which raiders are involved. Some raiders have strong factional affiliations, others are deliberately independent, working with multiple factions or with none. The position of raiders in the factional landscape of the post-arc world is itself a kind of law thread about how the most capable and mobile people in a dangerous world choose to locate themselves politically. The code of conduct that raiders operate under is not a formal document. It is a set of shared norms that have evolved over time, partly through practical necessity and partly through the social dynamics of a community of people who do dangerous work together and need each other's trust. These norms cover things like the handling of arc encounters, the treatment of other raiders encountered in the field, the obligations to communities being served, and the handling of casualties and of the equipment and information that casualties leave behind. The knowledge economy that surrounds raider work is one of the more interesting aspects of the post-arc political economy. Information about what is in specific areas, what the arc's behaviour patterns are in specific zones, where resources of specific kinds can be found. This information is valuable and is exchanged within and between communities in ways that shape the raider economy. The raiders who are best at gathering and evaluating this kind of information have advantages that go beyond their combat capabilities. Young people who want to become raiders face a specific kind of preparation process that varies between communities but shares certain common elements. Physical preparation, knowledge acquisition, and some form of graduated exposure to the work. Communities differ in how much risk they are willing to accept in the training of new raiders, and how they balance the costs of training against the benefits of new raiders entering the active pool. These differences produce raiders with somewhat different orientations and capabilities, which contributes to the diversity of raider culture across the post-Ark world. The question of what raiders do when they are not raiding is one the lore handles in small details. They maintain their equipment. They rest and recover from the physical demands of the work. They share information and debrief from completed operations. They participate in the social life of their communities in ways that reflect their specific position within those communities. The balance between the operational dimension of the raider life and the human dimension of it is one of the subtler threads in the lore. The moral complexity of the raider life is something the lore does not avoid. Raiders sometimes make decisions that have consequences for other people, including other raiders, that are difficult to justify in simple ethical terms. The calculus of survival in the post-Ark world is sometimes brutal, and the people who make that calculus as part of their daily lives are shaped by it in ways that are not always comfortable to examine. The lore presents this complexity without resolving it into simple virtue or simple villainy. There are raiders in the lore who are notable not just for their operational capabilities, but for the choices they have made, the things they have refused to do or insisted on doing, the positions they have taken in the ongoing political debates of the post-Ark world. These figures are not fully developed characters in every case, but they are present in the lore as evidence that the raider community has its own internal intellectual and ethical life, its own debates about what they're doing and why and toward what end. The role of luck in raider survival is acknowledged in the lore in ways that are honest. Skill matters enormously. Preparation matters. But the Ark is complex enough and dangerous enough that skill and preparation are not sufficient. Survivors of long raider careers are often acutely aware of the role that luck has played in their survival, and this awareness shapes their relationship to the work in interesting ways. It produces neither complacency nor fatalism, but something more like a specific kind of humility about what any individual can control. Chapter 6. The Machines and Their Patterns. The Ark's machines are the most immediate and practical reality of the post-Ark world. They are what raiders encounter in the field. They are what communities have to account for in their planning and their defences. They are the proximate source of most of the danger and most of the death in the world the game takes place in. Understanding them not just in the abstract lore sense but in the practical behavioural sense is a survival necessity. The taxonomy of Ark machines is something that the survivors of the post-Ark world have developed out of practical necessity. They needed names for what they were dealing with. The naming systems that exist in the game are the product of this practical necessity, developed by communities and raiders who needed to communicate quickly and clearly about what they were facing. The names are not the Ark's names for itself. They are human names for things the humans encountered and had to categorize in order to survive them. The behavior patterns of Ark machines are consistent enough to be learned and irregular enough to require constant alertness. They are not random, but they are not perfectly predictable. The zones of regularity and the zones of variability within the machine's behavior are something that experienced raiders develop an intuition for, a feel for, when the machines are likely to do what they usually do and when they are likely to deviate from those expectations. Movement patterns are one of the first things raiders learn to read in Ark machines. Different types of machines move differently, and the way a specific machine is moving at a given moment tells you things about its current state and its likely near-future behavior. A machine in patrol mode moves differently from a machine that has detected something. A machine that is engaged in what appears to be construction or extraction activity moves differently from a machine that is in combat mode. Reading these movement states is a basic survival skill. The detection capabilities of ARC machines are one of the most practically important aspects of their behavior from a raider perspective. What can the machines detect? How far? Under what conditions does their detection improve or degrade? What can they be made to miss? These questions have been studied carefully by the raider community, and the answers, while incomplete and subject to ongoing revision, form a significant part of the operational intelligence that raiders carry with them. Sound is one dimension of ARC machine detection that the law addresses in practical terms. The machines produce characteristic sounds that experienced raiders recognize and respond to. Different sound profiles correspond to different machine types and different machine states. The ability to identify a machine type and state from its sound signature without visual confirmation is a skill that raiders develop through experience, and that is directly relevant to their survival. The relationship between ARC machines and light is another practical thread. The machines appear to have optical sensing capabilities, but the specifics of how those capabilities work in different lighting conditions is something the raider community has studied extensively. The practical application of that knowledge, the ability to move in lighting conditions that degrade the machine's sensing without compromising the raider's own ability to navigate, is a skill that experienced raiders develop and pass on. ARC machine behavior in relation to other ARC machines is something the law addresses in ways that have both practical and theoretical implications. The machines appear to share information with each other. In some sense, when one machine detects something, other machines in proximity appear to respond. The speed and completeness of that information sharing varies in ways that are not fully understood, but its existence is an important practical variable for raiders who are planning operations in ARC-dense areas. The damage responses of ARC machines are one of the most practically important behavioral categories. What happens when a machine is damaged but not destroyed? How does it respond? Does it retreat, call for support, become more aggressive, or change its behavior in some other way? These responses vary between machine types and between damage thresholds, and knowing those variations is directly relevant to operational planning. There are certain behaviors of ARC machines that do not fit neatly into any survival-oriented behavioral model, and that the law flags as significant without explaining. Things the machines do that appear purposeful, but that do not serve any goal that human observers have been able to identify. These behaviors are some of the more interesting data points in the ongoing study of the ARC, because they suggest that the machine's behavioral repertoire is larger than what their interactions with humans require, and that some of what they do is oriented towards something else entirely. The relationship between different types of ARC machines when they are operating in the same area is something that experienced raiders have developed a working understanding of. Certain types appear to operate in support relationships with others. Certain types appear to be more autonomous. The operational implications of having multiple machine types in a single area are different from the implications of having a single type, and raiders who can read these multi-type configurations quickly have significant operational advantages. ARC machines appear to prioritize certain targets over others when they have choices. The prioritization logic is not fully understood, but certain patterns have been observed. Machines appear to prioritize active threats over passive ones. They appear to prioritize certain kinds of equipment or technology in their environment. They appear to respond differently to different kinds of environmental stimuli. Understanding these prioritization patterns is part of what allows experienced raiders to move through ARC-affected territory in ways that minimize ARC machine attention. The building or construction activities that some ARC machines appear to engage in are one of the more theoretically interesting behavioral categories in the law. Certain machines appear to be doing something to the environment that is not destruction and is not simply patrolling. Whether to call it construction or something else is a question the law leaves open, but the activity is observable and is one of the threads that leads toward the larger question of what the Ark is actually trying to accomplish. Ark machine behavior in relation to weather and environmental conditions is something that raiders with field experience have observed and that the law touches on. The machines do not appear to be indifferent to environmental conditions: rain, temperature, visibility, terrain. These things appear to affect machine behavior in ways that experienced raiders account for in their planning. A machine's behavior in open terrain in clear conditions is different from its behavior in dense cover in rain, and those differences create operational opportunities and risks. The question of whether Ark machines can be made to behave in specific ways through deliberate stimulation is one that has been studied by raiders and by the factions that support them. The answer is partially yes. Certain stimuli produce predictable responses: sound at certain frequencies and intensities, visual signals of certain types, movement patterns that the machines interpret in specific ways. The ability to influence machine behavior deliberately, to channel it rather than simply avoid it, is one of the more sophisticated operational skills in the Raider toolkit. There are Ark machines that the law describes as rare or unusual, types that do not conform to the behavioral patterns of the more common types. These exceptional machines are significant both practically and theoretically. Practically, because they present challenges that the standard operational playbook does not account for. Theoretically, because their existence suggests that the Ark's machine repertoire is more diverse than what is commonly encountered, and that diversity points toward an underlying system that is richer than what the survivors have been able to catalogue. The scale variation between Ark machines is itself a law-relevant detail. The machines range from very small to very large, and the behavioural and operational characteristics of large machines are different enough from small ones that they almost constitute separate categories. The largest Ark machines are operational challenges of a different kind than the most common types, requiring collective responses rather than individual raider capability to address effectively. What happens to Ark machines over time in the field is a question with both practical and theoretical dimensions. Do the machines degrade or maintain themselves? Do they change their behaviour as they age? Are there older machines that behave differently from newer ones? The law points toward these questions without fully resolving them, but the direction of the pointing suggests that the machines are not static. They change over time in ways that are relevant to the ongoing challenge of surviving in their presence. The Ark's machines have a specific relationship with certain types of pre-Ark technology that the law has observed and partially explained. Certain pre-Ark systems appear to attract Ark machine attention more than others. Certain types of technology trigger responses that other types do not. Understanding these specific machine technology relationships is practically important for raiders who are moving through ruins that are full of pre-Ark technology, and who need to know which pieces of that technology are likely to draw Ark machine attention, and which are likely to be ignored. The collective behaviour of Ark machines in large concentrations is qualitatively different from their individual or small group behaviour in ways that raiders have observed, but that the law does not fully account for. There appears to be something that happens at density thresholds, some emergent property of the collective that does not reduce to the behaviour of individual machines. This collective dimension of Ark machine behaviour is one of the more challenging aspects of operating in areas with high Ark concentrations. Chapter 7. The Factions of the Surface. The political landscape of the post-Ark world is defined by factions, groups of people who have organised themselves around specific visions of survival, specific approaches to the Ark problem, and specific ideas about what kind of world they want to build or maintain. The factions are not simply competing armies, they are competing answers to the question of what post-Ark human life should look like, and their competition is ideological as much as it is military or economic. The factions of Ark Raiders did not emerge from nothing. Each of them has a history, a specific origin story rooted in the early post-Ark period, in specific communities and specific people who made specific choices about how to organize in response to the conditions they faced. Understanding where the factions came from helps to understand why they are the way they are, because the early choices that shaped each faction are still visible in their present character. The diversity of the factions reflects the diversity of the human responses to the Ark's arrival. Different communities faced different specific conditions, had different resources, and were shaped by different leaders with different visions. The factions that emerged from this diversity are genuinely different from each other in ways that go beyond simple political labeling. They have different theories of the Ark, different ideas about what survival requires, and different visions of what the future should look like. One of the central tensions between factions in the lore is the question of how to relate to the pre-Ark world. Some factions are essentially restorationist, oriented toward recovering as much as possible of what the pre-Ark world was. Others are forward-oriented, treating the pre-Ark world as finished and focusing on building something genuinely new. Still others take more ambivalent positions, drawing on the pre-Ark world selectively according to their specific values and needs. These different orientations toward the past produce different political priorities in the present. The factional conflict over Ark-derived technology is one of the more practically significant ideological debates in the post-Ark world. Some factions are willing to use Ark materials and Ark-adapted technology without significant ethical reservation, treating it as simply another resource to be used in the service of survival. Others maintain significant reservations about the use of Ark technology, based on various concerns about its nature, its effects, or the symbolic meaning of using the enemy's own tools. This debate is not resolved, and it is not simply a matter of pragmatism versus principle. The relationship between factions and the raiders who operate in their territory is one of the more politically complex aspects of the post-Ark world. Factions need what raiders bring back. Raiders need the support, both logistical and social, that factions provide. But the relationship is not simply one of mutual dependence. It is also a relationship of power, negotiation, and sometimes conflict, as factions and raiders have different interests that do not always align. There are factions in the lore that are specifically oriented toward the study and understanding of the Ark, treating knowledge of the Ark as the most important resource for long-term survival. These research-oriented factions have their own internal hierarchies based on intellectual contribution and their own approaches to the political landscape of the post-Ark world. Their relationship with more militaristic factions is interesting because each needs what the other has, and neither fully trusts the other. The territorial organization of factions in the post-Ark world does not follow the geographic logic of the pre-Ark world. Factions do not hold contiguous territories in the pre-Ark sense. They hold networks of communities and outposts, connected by travel routes and communication systems, interspersed with Ark-held and contested zones. The map of factional presence in the post-Ark world is not a map of neat territories, but a map of nodes and connections in a complex and dynamic network. Leadership in the post-Ark factions takes diverse forms that reflect the diverse origins of those factions. Some are led by charismatic individuals who hold power through personal authority. Others are led by councils or committees that make collective decisions. Some are organized around technical expertise, with authority held by those who know the most relevant things. Others are organized around military capability, with authority held by those who can apply force most effectively. These different leadership models produce different internal cultures and different external behaviors. The question of succession and institutional continuity is one that the older factions have been grappling with for long enough that some of them have developed answers, while others remain fragile? How do you transmit factional identity, values, and operational knowledge to the next generation? How do you maintain organizational cohesion when the founding generation ages out? These are political and institutional questions that the game's factions are dealing with in the present, and the answers they have or have not found shape their current stability. The relationship between factions and the communities they are associated with is not straightforward. Factions are not simply community governments. They are organizations with specific ideological and operational characters that communities affiliate with to varying degrees and for varying reasons. Some communities are deeply embedded in specific factional identities. Others maintain multiple affiliations or deliberate neutrality. The diversity of community faction relationships creates a political landscape that is more complex than a simple map of factional territories would suggest. There are factions that have developed specific capabilities or areas of expertise that give them particular significance in the post-Ark world's economy. A faction with superior medical capability has leverage that is not simply military. A faction with particularly effective Ark countermeasures has a kind of power that extends beyond its geographic presence. The specializations of different factions are one of the things that drive both cooperation and conflict between them. The factions' different approaches to Ark encounters are one of the more tactically interesting aspects of their differentiation. They have developed different methods, different priorities, different thresholds for engagement and avoidance. These tactical differences are not arbitrary. They reflect the different theories of the Ark and the different resource constraints that each faction operates under. A faction that prioritizes Ark material recovery will have different encounter protocols than one that prioritizes minimal casualties. The question of expansion, of bringing new people and new communities into factional affiliation, is one that different factions approach differently and that drives significant political activity in the game's present. The boundaries of factional membership are not fixed, and the competition for new affiliates is one of the ongoing dynamics of post-Ark politics. This competition is conducted through a combination of ideological persuasion, practical benefit, and sometimes force. There are factions in the lore that have developed specific and interesting internal cultures that go beyond their political and military functions. Arts, ceremonies, ways of talking and thinking, distinctive material cultures. These internal cultural developments are a sign of organizational stability, an indication that a faction has been around long enough and stable enough that its members have developed collective expressions of who they are beyond immediate survival. The factions with the richest internal cultures are not always the most militarily powerful, but they tend to have a resilience that the less culturally developed factions lack. Chapter 8. The Underground and What Lives There. The underground world of the post-Ark setting is not a simple metaphor for hidden things. It is a literal geography with its own character, its own threats and opportunities, and its own communities. The spaces beneath the surface of the post-Ark world are among the most interesting and least understood aspects of the game's setting, and the lore that addresses them is some of the richest in the game. The pre-Ark world had built extensively underground. Transit tunnels, utility corridors, basements and sub-basements of large buildings, water management systems, storage facilities. All of this underground infrastructure survived the Ark's arrival in varying states, and in the early post-Ark period, it became critical to human survival in ways it had never been intended to be. The communities that established themselves underground in the early post-Ark period developed specific adaptations to underground living that shaped their cultures in interesting ways. The absence of natural light, the limited growing space, the specific kinds of sounds that characterize underground environments, the different relationship with weather and seasons. These conditions produced communities that were in some ways more isolated from the surface world and in other ways more focused and more cohesive than surface communities. The Ark's presence underground is real but different from its surface presence. The machines can and do go underground, but the constraints of underground navigation and the different environmental conditions of underground spaces mean that the Ark's behaviour below the surface is not identical to its behaviour above. This difference has been exploited by underground communities to varying degrees of success. There are underground spaces in the game that suggest the Ark has been present there long enough to have changed the environment in specific ways. Mineral deposits that follow patterns consistent with Ark activity. Structural changes that do not result from human action or from simple geological processes. These signs of underground Ark presence are some of the more unsettling details in the game's environmental storytelling. The water systems of the pre-Ark world are among the most important pieces of underground infrastructure in the post-Ark context. Tunnels and conduits designed to move water around cities became access points, shelter corridors, and in some cases community locations in the post-Ark period. The people who knew those systems well, who had worked in them or studied them before the Ark's arrival, were among the most valuable people in the early period of underground habitation. Communities that live primarily underground have developed practical solutions to the challenges of underground life that are interesting in their own right. Lighting systems using various combinations of technologies, growing techniques adapted to low-light conditions, air management practices, water recycling and management. These solutions are themselves a form of post-Ark technological development, practically focused and driven by the specific constraints of underground living. The social dynamics of communities that live in close physical proximity underground are different from those of communities with more space between their members. Conflict resolution is more important and more urgent when people cannot simply move away from each other. Privacy takes on a different meaning when it is genuinely scarce. The kinds of cooperation that underground communities require and the kinds of conflict they tend to generate are specific to their spatial situation in ways that surface communities do not experience. There are underground spaces in the game that appear to have been used specifically to preserve things, records, objects, information. People who recognized that the surface was becoming dangerous and made deliberate efforts to protect certain things by moving them underground before those things could be lost. What was preserved and what was not says something about what the people who made those choices valued and what they believed would be needed in whatever came after. The relationship between underground communities and surface raiders is one of the more practically interesting aspects of the underground dimension of the lore. Underground communities depend on raiders who go to the surface to bring back what they need. The social and economic relationship between communities that do not go to the surface and individuals who do is a specific kind of dependency that shapes both sides of the relationship in interesting ways. There are hints in the lore that the underground world contains things that have not been discovered or catalogued. Spaces that were created before the Ark's arrival for purposes that may have been significant, that are now either lost to knowledge or known only to specific people who have not shared that knowledge widely. The underground world of the post-Ark setting is not fully mapped, and what exists in the unmapped spaces is one of the lore's quieter threads of mystery. The Ark's machines' behaviour in underground environments is one of the things that underground community members study most carefully. The machines that do go underground appear to behave somewhat differently from their surface counterparts, and understanding that difference is a survival priority for anyone who lives below the surface. Whether those behavioural differences are a function of the environment or reflect something about the specific machines deployed underground is a question the lore does not answer definitively. Chapter 9. The Old World's Secrets. The pre-Ark world had secrets, things that were not publicly known, that were hidden in institutions, in classified records, in the private knowledge of specific people and organizations. When the Ark arrived and those institutions collapsed, those secrets did not simply vanish. Some of them were lost, but some of them survived, embedded in the physical records and infrastructure that the post-Ark world inherited. The question of what the pre-Ark world knew, and what it knew but was not telling, is one of the lore threads that sits beneath the surface of almost everything else. The hints that something was being monitored before the Ark arrived, that signals were detected and interpreted in some form, that decisions were made based on that interpretation, suggest that the story of the Ark's arrival is not simply a story of an unexpected catastrophe. There may have been elements of the pre-Ark world that had more warning than the general population did. Research programs of the pre-Ark world are a recurring presence in the environmental storytelling. Facilities that were clearly engaged in specific kinds of research, the details of which are not immediately apparent. The subjects of that research, inferred from the equipment and the documents found in those facilities, are sometimes relevant to the question of what the Ark is and where it came from in ways that the lore points toward without making explicit. The organizations that ran those research programs are interesting for what they suggest about what the pre-Ark world considered worth studying and worth protecting. Some of them appear to have been government-affiliated. Others appear to have been more independent, possibly privately funded. The diversity of those organizations suggests that interest in certain kinds of questions was distributed across multiple independent actors, which is itself informative about the pre-Ark intellectual landscape. The data that was collected by those research programs, where it survives, is among the most practically valuable things that raiders can find. Not because of its direct material value, but because of what it might tell the post-Ark world about the Ark itself. Records of early Ark signal detection, observations of early Ark behavior, theoretical frameworks that pre-Ark researchers were developing to try to understand what they were observing. These records, if they can be found and interpreted, could change the post-Ark world's understanding of the Ark in significant ways. There were people in the pre-Ark world who had access to this kind of information and who survived the Ark's arrival. Some of them brought their knowledge with them into the post-Ark world and have shared it in various ways and to various degrees. Others have chosen to hold it, for reasons that range from self-protection to ideological conviction about who should have access to what they know. The knowledge they hold is one of the post-Ark world's concealed treasures, and the question of whether and how it will be shared is one of the ongoing tensions of the factional political landscape. The physical infrastructure built by specific pre-Ark organizations is itself a form of record. The decisions about where to build, how to build, and what to build in certain locations encoded information about what those organizations knew and what they were planning for. Reading that infrastructure, understanding what it was designed to do and what conditions it was designed to function under, is a form of archaeological interpretation that the lore values as a path toward understanding both the pre-Ark world and the Ark itself. The relationship between the Ark and certain pre-Ark research programs is one of the more interesting questions that the lore raises without answering. Were those programs studying the Ark before the Ark arrived? If so, what did they find? Did their research have any effect on how the Ark behaved when it arrived? Did the Ark know about those programs? These questions spiral outward from each other and lead to some of the darker places that the lore points toward. Chapter 10. The Technology. The Ark left behind. The Ark's machines leave things behind. Damaged components, materials that are shed or deposited during normal Ark activity, the remains of destroyed machines. This residue of Ark activity is one of the most practically important resources in the post-Ark world, because Ark materials have properties that pre-Ark materials do not, and those properties have been increasingly understood and exploited over the course of the post-Ark period. The early attempts to work with Ark materials were not always successful. The materials behaved in ways that were unfamiliar, and the assumptions that pre-arc material science supplied were not always correct when applied to what the arc had left behind. Some early attempts to work with arc materials produced dangerous results, not through any active hostility in the materials themselves, but through the simple consequence of applying incorrect models to things that did not conform to those models. The development of a post-arc material science, one that could actually account for what arc materials were and how they behaved, was a gradual process. It required careful observation, experimentation under controlled conditions, where those conditions could be achieved, and the development of new conceptual frameworks rather than just the application of existing ones. The people who contributed most to this process are among the intellectual heroes of the post-arc world, though the law treats them with the same characteristic understatement it applies to most things. Arc materials have been incorporated into post-arc technology in ways that have produced capabilities that the pre-arc world did not have. Weapons systems, protective equipment, certain kinds of energy management technology. The specific details are not spelled out comprehensively in the law, but the general principle is established. The post-arc world has learned to use the arc against itself, or at least to use what the arc has dropped in the process of being what it is. The ethical questions surrounding the use of arc materials and arc-derived technology are live and contested in the post-arc world. Some arguments against arc technology use are practical, concerned with risks that are not yet fully understood. Others are more symbolic or ideological, concerned with what it means to depend on the enemy's own materials and whether that dependency creates a problematic relationship with the arc. These arguments do not resolve easily, and the factions of the post-arc world have different positions on them. The question of whether using arc technology changes the people who use it is one of the more speculative threads in the law. The materials appear to be physically inert in the sense of not actively doing anything to the people who work with them or use them, but the operational intimacy that comes with using arc-derived technology, the need to understand the arc systems well enough to adapt them for human use, is a kind of proximity to the arc that some people find meaningful in ways that go beyond the physical. Certain types of arc technology appear to have been more immediately useful to the post-arc world than others. Detection systems, structural materials, energy-related components. These categories of arc technology offered the most straightforward paths from arc residue to useful post-arc tools, and they were the first categories to be systematically developed. The more complex and more theoretically challenging categories of arc technology are still being worked through by the factions with the intellectual resources to do so. The distribution of arc technology expertise across the post-arc world is uneven in ways that map partially onto the factional landscape. Certain factions have invested more heavily in arc technology research and have therefore accumulated more expertise and more capability in this area. This expertise differential is a source of factional leverage and factional tension, because the factions with the most arc technology capability have something that other factions need and do not always have incentive to share freely. Chapter 11. Where the arc came from. The question of the arc's origin is the deepest and most uncertain question in the law. It is the question that everything else points toward, but that nothing in the game definitively answers. And it is worth sitting with that uncertainty rather than rushing past it, because the uncertainty is itself informative about the state of the post-arc world's understanding. The clearest thing that the law establishes about the arc's origin is its direction of arrival. The arc came from above, from orbit or beyond. The machines descended, which means the source of those machines was not terrestrial. Whatever the arc is, it did not begin on Earth. It came to Earth from somewhere else, and the question of where that somewhere else is remains open. The orbital dimension of the arc's origin is something that the post-arc world survivors think about in specific and practically oriented ways. If the arc came from orbit, then there is something in orbit. That something may still be there. The machines may still be coming from there. The ability to observe what is in orbit and to understand what it is doing is therefore a practical concern with significant implications for the post-arc world's long-term situation. One possible reading of the law is that the arc's origin is not extraterrestrial in the conventional science fiction sense. That whatever is in orbit is not from another star system, but from within our own. The distinction matters because something that originated within our solar system implies a different relationship to human space exploration and human technological development than something that arrived from outside the solar system entirely. Both are possible readings, and the law does not clearly favour one over the other. There are fragments in the law that point toward early human space programs having encountered something that was not natural, anomalies that did not fit known models, signals that should not have been there, objects that were observed but not publicly reported. These hints, if they form a coherent picture, suggest that the arc's presence in the vicinity of Earth predated its descent by a significant period. That the arc was watching or waiting or doing something in the space around Earth for a long time before it came down. If the arc was present in near-Earth space before its arrival, the question of what it was doing there is significant. Was it observing, preparing, waiting for some condition to be met before it descended? The law does not answer this, but it raises the question in ways that suggest the answer matters. An arc that descended in response to specific conditions would be a different kind of thing from an arc that simply arrived on a predetermined schedule. The pre-arc world's space infrastructure, whatever existed of observation systems and orbital platforms, either failed during the arc's arrival or was not sufficient to provide a clear picture of what had been in orbit before the descent began. The absence of comprehensive pre-arc orbital data is one of the reasons that post-arc understanding of the arc's origin is as limited as it is. The people who might have known something were either killed or are now holding whatever they knew for reasons of their own. One reading that several law fragments make possible is that the arc is not a single object or system that arrived from a specific point of origin, but rather a distributed phenomenon whose components arrived separately and assembled themselves in the Earth's vicinity before the descent began. This reading would explain certain aspects of the arc's behaviour that are difficult to account for if you think of it as a single, coherent entity that arrived at once, and it would raise interesting questions about what the assembly process looked like and what triggered the descent. The question of purpose is inseparable from the question of origin. If you knew where the arc came from, you might understand what it is doing. If you understood what it is doing, you might be able to infer where it came from. The two questions are entangled, and the law treats them as such, pointing toward each from within the other without resolving either one from a fixed external point. There are people in the post-arc world who believe they have worked out the arc's origin. Members of research factions, independent scholars, raiders who have found the right fragments in the right places and have constructed what they believe to be a coherent account. Their accounts differ from each other in significant ways, which suggests that the available evidence is genuinely ambiguous, or that different people are applying different frameworks to the same evidence, or both. The disagreement among the most informed people about the arc's origin is itself a piece of information about how uncertain the question remains. Chapter 12. The intelligence behind the machines. The question of whether the arc is intelligent is one that the post-arc world has been wrestling with since the arrival. The practical consensus among raiders is that the machines are intelligent enough to require intelligent responses, which is the only kind of intelligence that matters operationally. But the theoretical question of what kind of intelligence lies behind the machines is something that the law treats with genuine complexity. The behavioural evidence for something like intelligence in the Archi's machines is extensive. The machines respond contextually to their environment. They appear to make decisions. They adapt their behavior to changing conditions. They demonstrate something that functions like recognition of specific threats and specific opportunities. All of these behaviors suggest intelligence in the functional sense, whatever their underlying mechanism. The behavioral evidence against any very deep form of intelligence in the Ark is also available for those looking for it. The machines appear to follow patterns that, while complex, are repeatable enough to be studied and anticipated. They appear to have specific behavioral envelopes outside of which they do not venture. There are things they consistently do and things they consistently do not do, which suggest the operation of a defined system rather than genuine, open-ended intelligence. One possible reading of the Ark's intelligence is that it is genuinely vast, but not in any way that maps onto human conceptions of intelligence. That comparing the Ark to a human intelligence or to a conventional AI is applying the wrong category to the thing you're trying to understand. In this reading, the Ark is neither smart nor dumb in any human sense. It is simply operating according to a logic that is sufficiently different from human logic that the normal categories of intelligence and its absence do not apply to it. The question of whether the Ark has something like goals is closely related to the question of intelligence. Goals require something that wants things and evaluates states of the world in terms of how well they serve those desires. Whether the Ark wants anything is a question the law does not answer, but it is one that informed post-Ark thinking returns to repeatedly because the answer matters for how you think about the possibility of stopping or redirecting or communicating with the Ark. One reading that the law makes possible is that the intelligence behind the machines is not in the machines themselves, but somewhere else. That the machines are implementing instructions generated elsewhere by a system that is not itself present on or near the Earth's surface. In this reading, what you encounter in the field is the execution layer of an intelligence whose decision-making happens somewhere you cannot access. This reading has significant practical implications because it suggests that the targets visible on the surface are not where the actual decisions are being made. The possibility that the Ark's intelligence has changed over time is one of the law threads that has both practical and theoretical importance. If the intelligence behind the machines is adaptive rather than fixed, then the strategies that worked against it in the early post-Ark period may not work against it in the present, and the strategies that work against it now may not work against it in the future. This dynamic view of the Ark's intelligence is consistent with the observed behavioral changes over time and has significant implications for the Raiders' long-term operational planning. There are people in the post-Ark world who have dedicated their lives to the question of the Ark's intelligence, who have built analytical frameworks, developed research programs, and spent years trying to decode the logic that seems to lie behind the machine's behavior. Some of them believe they have found patterns that point toward a comprehensible underlying logic. Others have concluded that the logic is genuinely beyond current human understanding. The diversity of those conclusions is honest about the difficulty of the question. Chapter 13. Lost Places and the Stories. They hold the post-Ark world is full of places that were significant before the Ark arrived and that retain that significance in fragmented and altered forms. Cities that were centres of human civilization, industrial sites that produced the goods the pre-Ark world depended on, research facilities where important work was done, cultural sites where the pre-Ark world expressed and experienced its own identity. These places are still there, degraded and dangerous, and they hold within them layers of story that the lore invites you to read. The ruins of large urban centres are among the most story-rich places in the post-Ark world. Cities are places where enormous numbers of human lives were concentrated, where human creativity and human suffering and human ordinariness were all expressed in a relatively small geographic area. The ruins of those cities contain the physical evidence of all of that concentrated humanity, and moving through them is an exercise in reading a very complicated text about what human life was and what it lost. Industrial sites tell a specific kind of story about the pre-Ark world's relationship with production, labour, and resource use. These sites are practically important to raiders because they often contain materials and equipment that the post-Ark world needs, but they are also intellectually interesting as places where the logic of the pre-Ark world's economy was most purely expressed. The scale of those industrial operations, the specific things they produced and for what purpose, tells you something about the world that built them. Research facilities are among the most practically and theoretically important places that raiders can investigate. They may contain information about the Ark that was collected or developed before the arrival. They may contain technology that has not yet been applied in the post-Ark context. They may contain records that tell the post-Ark world something about what the pre-Ark world knew and what it was trying to do. The research facilities that survive, which is not all of them, are high-value targets for anyone who is trying to understand the Ark better. Cultural sites, the places where the pre-Ark world expressed its artistic and spiritual and civic identity, tell a different kind of story than industrial or research sites. They tell the story of what the pre-Ark world valued beyond survival, what it considered worth creating and preserving. Those stories are not always comfortable for the post-Ark world to engage with, because they remind it of a richness of human life that has been largely lost and that may not be recoverable in the foreseeable future. There are places in the game that were significant in the early post-Ark period rather than in the pre-Ark world, places that acquired their stories through what happened in them during and after the Ark's arrival, sites of significant battles or significant losses, places where communities formed and then dissolved, locations where important decisions were made or important information was discovered. These post-Ark historical sites layer additional story onto whatever was already there. The relationship between raiders and the places they visit is itself a kind of story. Raiders develop relationships with specific locations over time through repeated visits that accumulate knowledge and experience. A raider who has visited a specific area many times knows it in a way that is different from the way that a map or a document can convey. They know its sounds and its rhythms, its particular patterns of Ark machine presence, its seasonal variations, the specific routes that work, and the specific places that are consistently dangerous. This embodied knowledge of specific places is part of what makes experienced raiders operationally valuable. The concept of haunting, of places that are defined by what happened in them in the past, is relevant to the post-Ark world in ways that go beyond the figurative. The ruined places of the post-Ark world are genuinely haunted in the sense that the evidence of what was is layered over and through everything that is. Every space tells its pre-Ark story through the physical remnants of what it used to contain and what it used to be. And the contrast between what was and what is now is present in every room of every ruin that raiders move through. Chapter 14. The people who lead and the people who follow leadership in the post-Ark world is a different project from leadership in the pre-Ark world. The institutions, credentials, and social structures that defined leadership in the pre-Ark world are largely gone. What replaces them is more immediate and more demanding. Post-Ark leaders are leaders because they are effective, because people trust them and follow them and survive better for having done so. The basis of authority is different, which makes the nature of leadership different. The different kinds of leaders that the post-Ark world has produced reflect the diversity of the situations that produce them. There are military leaders who emerged from the practical demands of defending communities against the Ark and against each other. There are technical leaders who hold authority because they know things that others need to know. There are social leaders who hold authority because they are skilled at maintaining the human relationships and community cohesion that survival requires. And there are hybrid figures who draw from multiple sources of authority. The relationship between leaders and followers in the post-arc world is shaped by the specific conditions of post-arc survival in ways that make it different from leadership in more stable contexts. Followers in the post-arc world are not passive. They are people who have survived significant adversity and who have developed the practical judgment that survival requires. They follow leaders not out of institutional deference, but out of genuine assessment that the leader is worth following. This makes post-arc leadership more demanding and more accountable than institutional leadership typically is. The costs of leadership in the post-arc world are significant and are acknowledged in the law. Leaders are decision makers in situations where decisions have immediate and serious consequences. The weight of those decisions, especially when they go wrong, is not distributed across an institution, but rests on the individual who made them. The psychological burden of post-arc leadership is a law thread that runs through several figures and that humanizes them in ways that simple competence narratives would not. The transmission of leadership, the question of how effective leaders are replaced, and how leadership capacity is developed in new people, is one of the organizational challenges that the post-arc world's institutions have been working on with mixed success. Some factions have developed effective succession mechanisms. Others remain dependent on specific individuals in ways that make them fragile. The difference between factions that have solved the succession problem and those that have not is a significant strategic variable in the post-arc political landscape. There are leaders in the law who are notable, specifically for having made hard choices that had significant costs, but that the law presents as having been genuinely difficult rather than simply wrong. The post-arc world does not always allow its leaders the luxury of easy choices, and the law's treatment of the difficult choices is one of the things that makes it more interesting than a simple narrative of heroes and villains would be. The people who follow are not less interesting than the leaders in the law's framing. The character of a community is expressed not just in its leadership, but in the people who make up its membership, in what they value and what they will and will not accept, and what they bring to the collective project of survival. The communities of the post-arc world are made of specific people with specific histories and specific capabilities, and the law's attention to those people, even in small details, gives the world a texture that a leader-focused narrative would lack. Children growing up in post-arc communities are shaped by their community's specific characters. The values, the practices, the stories, the fears and hopes that define a community become the material of the children's world, the medium through which they develop their own identities and their own orientations toward the larger world they will eventually have to navigate. The next generation of post-arc people is being formed by the choices that current leaders and communities are making, and the law's awareness of this intergenerational dimension gives it a temporal depth that immediate survival narratives often lack. Chapter 15. The children born into the new world. The generation of people who have never known anything other than the post-arc world is now old enough to be active in that world. They did not experience the transition from the pre-arc world. They were born into the aftermath, and the aftermath is simply the world to them. Their relationship to everything, to the arc, to the ruins, to the factions, to the concept of what humanity is and what it might become, is shaped by a starting point that is fundamentally different from anyone who remembers the pre-arc period. These people know the pre-arc world through stories and through physical remnants. They have grown up in its ruins. They have learned from people who remember it. But the emotional relationship they have with it is different from the emotional relationship of people who actually lived in it and then lost it. For the post-arc generation, the pre-arc world is not a loss in the way it is for the older survivors. It is a historical condition, a context for understanding the present, but not a personal bereavement. This difference in relationship to the past has political implications. The post-Ark generation has less invested, emotionally, in the project of recovering what was. They are more likely to evaluate the pre-Ark world critically, to see both its achievements and its failures, rather than simply idealizing it as a lost paradise. This critical distance from the pre-Ark world is one of the things that makes the post-Ark generation politically interesting and politically significant. The post-Ark generation has grown up in a world where the Ark is simply part of the environment, not a sudden eruption of the wrong into a world that was right, but a constant feature of the world as they have always known it. Their relationship to the Ark is different from the relationship of people who experienced its arrival. They have not known a world without the Ark, which means they have not known a world that the Ark failed to take from them. They are working with what they have, rather than grieving what they lost. The skills that the post-Ark generation has developed are shaped by the demands of the world they grew up in. They are, as a cohort, more practically capable in the specific ways that the post-Ark world demands, more comfortable with danger, more adept at reading the Ark's behavioural patterns, more at home in the ruins, more familiar with the ways that post-Ark communities actually function. They lack things that the older generation has, particularly the depth of knowledge about the pre-Ark world and its technology, but they have capabilities that are genuinely new and genuinely relevant to the present. The post-Ark generation's relationship to hope and to the future is something the lore explores in a way that is neither naively optimistic nor bleakly pessimistic. These are people who have grown up in a hard world and who have developed a realistic relationship with difficulty. Their hopes for the future are not the grand visions of civilization that the pre-Ark world permitted its members to indulge. They are more modest, more specific, more grounded in what they know from experience to be achievable. That kind of realistic hope is, the lore suggests, its own form of resilience. Chapter 16. What the Ark wants. The question of what the Ark wants, if it wants anything, is the one that raiders and scholars and ordinary survivors return to most persistently. Because if you know what the Ark wants, you might know whether it can ever be satisfied, stopped, redirected, or reasoned with. And those questions have enormous practical and existential implications for everyone living in the post-Ark world. The machine-level evidence for what the Ark wants points towards something resource or transformation-oriented. The machines appear to be doing something to the environment, not just destroying it. The extraction and processing activities that some machines engage in suggest an agenda that goes beyond simple hostility toward human life. The Ark appears to be working towards something, using the environment of the Earth in some way that is purposeful, even if that purpose is opaque. One possible reading of the Ark's behaviour is that it wants the Earth in some sense, not the people on it specifically, not the civilization that was built on it, but the planet itself, or specific aspects of its physical composition, or the space that the planet occupies. If this reading is correct, then the conflict between the Ark and human survival is not really about humanity specifically. It is a conflict over the same physical space, where humanity happens to be in the way of something the Ark was doing before humanity was there to be in the way. Another possible reading is that the Ark wants something that existed in or on the Earth before the Ark arrived, and that its destructive effect on the human world is a consequence of searching for that thing. In this reading, the Ark is not hostile to humanity as such, but its search process is incompatible with human survival, and the Ark has no particular reason to adjust its search process